The wind had a way of whispering through the bones of Dry Creek, as if it mourned the things the people here had forgotten how to grieve. Snow fell soft as ash, settling over the old chapel at the edge of town, a white shroud over weathered wood. Inside, candles burned themselves to nothing. And outside, on the frozen steps, sat a woman in a wedding dress, her veil torn by the wind, her hands blue with cold, her eyes staring at nothing. Her name was Clara May Bennett, 24, daughter of a cattleman who'd lost his herd to drought and pride. She'd been promised to Thomas Avery, a banker's son with smooth hands and smoother lies. But when the hour came, and the preacher's clock struck noon, only the wind kept its word. The carriages rolled away. The guests muttered behind their gloves. The town that had envied her now pitied her, and pity, in Dry Creek, was colder than snow. Clara didn't move. She sat on those steps until the sun fell, until the light itself seemed to give up on her. Her bouquet lay beside her, frozen to the stone. She whispered once, to no one in particular, maybe he just lost his way. But the truth had already reached her heart, like a slow bullet. He hadn't lost his way. He'd found another. By nightfall, the snow turned to ice. Her breath came in shallow ghosts. If she died there, she thought, maybe it would be better. Quieter. But the world wasn't done with her yet. Not while a man named Elias Ward was still out on the northern road, a widower with grief buried deep, and a promise to a wife he'd never stop talking to beneath the stars. That night, with the sky bruised by storm and moonlight, his horse stumbled to a halt by the chapel gate. He saw her there, still as a gravestone angel, white against the dark, and something in him, long asleep, began to stir. He dismounted, slow and quiet, removed his hat, and whispered, as though afraid to wake her, "Ma'am, you shouldn't be here alone." The bride turned her head, her eyes dull as spent embers. And though he didn't yet know it, in saving her, he was about to save himself. Elias Ward had long ago learned that some ghosts don't haunt you, you carry them. His wife, Mary, had been gone 3 winters now, taken by fever in the spring that never came. He'd buried her beneath the cottonwoods on the edge of his ranch, and every Sunday since, he'd spoken to the wind as if it still carried her answers. He wasn't a man who stopped for much anymore. Not for storms, not for sorrow, not for company. But that night, something in the snow pulled his reins. The moon came out from behind the clouds, and there she was. A girl in white, half buried by drifts, her lips pale as frost. A wedding dress, in the middle of a storm. He thought at first she was a spirit, some soul caught between heaven and earth. But when she breathed, barely, his own heart seemed to jolt back to life. He lifted her gently, her body cold but light as forgiveness. Her veil tore as he carried her to his horse, and for a moment, the tattered lace caught on the chapel rail, like the last piece of her still clinging to the past. The wind howled through the empty steeple as if in protest, and the snow closed in behind him like a curtain falling on the end of a play. He didn't look back. The trail home was long, 20 miles through darkness and drifting ice. He rode steady, the woman's head against his shoulder, her breath faint but there. Her dress shimmered in the moonlight like something unreal. He wondered what story had left her out there to die, but some questions were too cruel to ask the night. By dawn, the storm broke. His cabin appeared through the mist, a lonely shape against a sea of white. The fire inside was nothing but embers, but he lit it again, quick as he could, and laid her by the hearth. For a long while he just sat there, watching the flames lick warmth into her cheeks, watching life creep back where he thought none remained. He found himself praying, not to bring back Mary, not this time, but for this stranger, this girl in white, to stay. When her eyes finally fluttered open, they met his, and he froze. In those eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in years. Not beauty, not pity, but a mirror. 2 people who'd both lost too much, finding one another at the edge of what they could bear. Outside, the snow fell soft again, not cruel this time, but kind. Like the world was trying, in its quiet way, to start over. And so, in a cabin far from town, 2 hearts began the slow, uncertain work of thawing. For 2 days, she drifted between fever and silence, her dreams tangled with snow, bells, and laughter that had turned to shame. He stayed beside her, feeding the fire, melting snow for water, listening to the wind moan across the roof like some lost hymn. When she woke again, she whispered one name. Daniel. It wasn't his. But he said nothing. Some pain is too sacred to touch. Her name was Clara. Her hands trembled as she tried to sit up, and he noticed the ring missing from her finger, only the pale mark where it once had been. She told him, in pieces, what happened, how she'd been left at the chapel steps, a note pinned to her dress, and the man she was to marry had taken the money and gone. She'd waited until the candles burned out. Then the snow began. Elias listened, not as a man who pitied her, but as one who understood the kind of silence that follows betrayal. That night, she asked him, "Why did you stop? You didn't even know me." He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting off the silver buckle she'd noticed on his belt. "For 3 years," he said quietly, "I've been praying for a reason to ride again. And then I found you." The cabin went still after that, only the crackle of the fire and the storm easing outside. Two souls who had buried their yesterdays sat close enough to feel each other's warmth, yet far enough to keep their ghosts between them. In the flicker of the light, Clara saw a photograph on the mantel, a woman smiling, holding a child that never grew up. Mary Ward, Elias's wife. The air between them shifted, not with jealousy, but with the soft ache of knowing they were both graves with hearts still beating inside. When she said, "I'm sorry," he shook his head. "Don't be. You didn't take anything from me. You just reminded me there's still something left to give." And for the first time in a long while, he smiled, not wide, not bright, but true. Outside, the snow stopped. A single beam of morning light broke through the clouds, glinting off her torn veil still hanging from the saddle rail outside. Two ghosts, one fire, and a world quietly daring them to begin again. Morning broke soft and pale across the snow. The world outside was a field of silver silence, and the cabin, warm with firelight and breath, felt like a place halfway between life and a dream. Elias stepped outside with his hat pulled low. His boots sank deep in the snow as he walked to fetch water from the creek. The storm had stripped the land clean, just white, and the echo of crows in the distance. And there, caught in a drift by the trail, something small glimmered in the sun, a circle of gold, thin and cold as memory. He lifted it from the snow, a wedding ring, engraved on the inside, "To forever, Daniel Clara." For a long moment, he just stared at it. Then he closed his hand around it and whispered, "Forever's not what folks think it is." When he came back inside, she was awake, wrapped in his coat, watching him through tired eyes. He held out the ring, resting in his rough palm. "This yours?" Her breath caught. She looked away. "I threw it when he left," she said quietly. "I thought if I buried it, maybe I could bury what I felt." He nodded. "Thing about gold," he said, "is it don't stay buried long. The earth keeps pushing it back up." She smiled, faintly, like sunlight on melting frost. He set the ring on the table beside her, but didn't press her to take it. That night, as the fire dimmed, Elias sat alone outside the cabin, turning the ring between his fingers. He thought of his own wife, Mary, how her wedding band still hung from the chain around his neck, how some promises were meant to stay broken so others could begin. He went back inside, placed the ring on the mantel beside Mary's photo, and whispered to both ghosts, "Maybe it's time we let the living try again." The next morning, Clara found the ring there, resting between the two lives that had shaped her second chance. She didn't put it back on. Not yet. But she didn't throw it away either. Instead, she touched it gently, and whispered, "Maybe one day, when forever means something new." And Elias, hearing her from the porch, closed his eyes and smiled, because the sound of her voice felt like forgiveness carried on the wind. It had been 3 days since the storm broke. The drifts outside the cabin had begun to sink beneath the sun, and the first signs of spring whispered through the frost, the sound of melting ice, the call of a lone hawk, the hush that always comes before renewal. Inside, Clara stirred from her cot. Her hands were steadier now. The fever had burned itself away, leaving behind only the thin ache of a body learning to live again. Elias was outside splitting wood. Each strike of the axe carried a rhythm, not of anger, but of patience. It was a man's prayer turned into motion. When she tried to stand, the world tilted. The floorboards creaked beneath her bare feet, the air cold against her skin. She reached for the wall, steadying herself, then took one step, and another. He looked through the open door and saw her there, frail, trembling, but standing in her wedding dress, the torn hem brushing the floor like snow caught in wind. "You ought to rest," he said softly, resting the axe against the porch rail. "I've rested enough," she whispered, and smiled that shy, quiet smile, the kind that belongs to women who have been broken, but refused to stay fallen. He didn't argue. Instead, he nodded toward the kettle. Coffee's on the stove, strong enough to wake the dead. She poured him a cup with hands that still shook a little, and the moment felt ordinary, so painfully ordinary that it hurt. Because sometimes, after all the storms and sorrow, ordinary feels like a miracle. As the days passed, she began helping around the cabin, mending torn shirts, brushing the horse, humming to herself as she swept the porch. Her laughter, soft, uncertain at first, slowly filled the silence that had haunted Elias for years. Sometimes, he'd catch himself just watching her, the way light caught her hair, the way she'd stop to look at the horizon as if remembering someone. There was something unspoken between them, not love, not yet, but a promise quietly taking root. One evening, she stood by the fence, looking out at the fields still half buried in snow. Elias joined her, hands tucked into his coat, breath clouding the air. "Funny," she said, "how life starts over when you least expect it." He looked at her, the woman left at the church steps, and for the first time, he saw not a bride who'd been abandoned, but someone who'd come back from the grave of heartbreak. He tipped his hat slightly. Sometimes it just needs a little kindness to thaw. And in the soft silence that followed, the wind carried the faintest echo of chapel bells, not a memory this time, but a promise waiting to be written. By the time the snow melted off the ridges, Dry Hollow began to breathe again. The creek ran clear for the first time in months, and the hills shimmered in pale green, the color of beginnings. Elias had almost forgotten what spring felt like. The land had been nothing but ghosts and wind since Mary died, the cabin a shelter for memories too heavy to carry anywhere else. But now, each sunrise seemed to ask him to try again. Clara helped him fix the corral fence that winter storms had torn down. Her hands, once soft and trembling, grew sure around the hammer. She worked beside him without complaint, her laughter bright as the morning light. At night, they'd sit by the fire, two souls who'd both lost their homes, building one from silence and shared breath. Sometimes, he'd catch her humming an old church tune. It reminded him of Sunday mornings long ago, of hymns sung low by women in white gloves and men who had hope in their hats. And he thought, maybe hope had never really left. It had just gone quiet, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. One afternoon, Clara found a small patch of wildflowers near the stream, bluebells, shy and stubborn against the last of the frost. She picked a few and set them in a tin cup on the table. Elias noticed, but didn't say a word. Instead, that evening, he sanded a piece of driftwood smooth, and carved into it a name, Clara's Spring. He nailed it to the porch rail, and when she saw it the next morning, she turned away so he wouldn't see her eyes glisten. There were no confessions between them, no grand gestures or vows, just the quiet rhythm of two lives mending in the same heartbeat. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the plains, Clara stood beside him watching the sky burn down to embers. The wind carried the smell of earth and rain. "Feels like the world forgave us," she said softly. Elias nodded, his voice low as the twilight. "Or maybe it was waiting for us to forgive ourselves." And there it was, the smallest smile between them, warm enough to light every dark place that had once felt beyond saving. The next morning, she left her torn wedding dress folded on the bed, washed and mended. In its place, she wore one of Mary's old aprons, and when Elias saw her sweeping the porch, he didn't see a ghost anymore. He saw a woman alive. It began with a sky that looked like bruised glass. Heavy clouds rolled over the ridge, slow, black, and silent, the kind that make a man feel small again. Elias knew the look of it. He'd seen storms like that take barns, fences, even lives. By noon, the wind had turned sharp, and the cattle were restless in the pen. "Best tie down the roof latch," he said, his voice calm but tight. Clara was beside him, helping gather the tools, her hair whipping wild around her face. The scent of rain, sharp and electric, filled the air. When the first drops fell, they were fat and cold, each one heavy as memory. The wind followed, screaming through the hollows, tearing at the cabin door like something alive. Inside, they moved fast, closing shutters, stacking wood, covering the fire. The sky turned greenish, the light sickly and strange. Then the storm came down. Thunder shook the walls, and the roof groaned with every gust. Elias braced the door while Clara held a lantern, its light trembling with her hands. And yet, in all that chaos, she felt something steady. His voice, low and sure, telling her it would pass. That every storm did. A loose shutter slammed against the window, glass splintering inward. She flinched. He was there in an instant, pulling her close, his coat shielding her from flying shards. For a heartbeat, they stood pressed together, breath to breath, the sound of rain roaring around them. Outside, lightning carved the hills white. Inside, the only light came from the fire, and the warmth between two people who hadn't asked for rescue, but found it anyway. When the wind finally eased, they stayed where they were, not out of fear, but because neither wanted to move. The storm had passed, but something had shifted in its wake, something wordless and alive. Later, when the rain softened to a hush, Elias stepped outside to check the fences. The sky was torn open, a strip of blue behind the clouds. He turned back toward the cabin. Through the doorway, he saw her, Clara, kneeling by the fire, drying her hair with one of his shirts. For the first time since Mary died, the sight of a woman in his home didn't feel like loss. It felt like grace. That night, as the rain tapped soft on the roof, she whispered, "I used to think storms were punishment." He looked at her, eyes gentle. Sometimes they're the only thing strong enough to wash the pain away. And in that flicker of silence that followed, they didn't touch. They didn't need to. Because some love stories begin not with a kiss, but with two souls surviving the same storm. By midsummer, Dry Hollow had changed. The storms had washed the dust from the valley, and the world wore green like forgiveness. Elias hitched the wagon early that morning. He told Clara they'd need to ride into town for supplies, flour, nails, and a new roof beam. But she knew there was more to it. It had been 6 months since that day at the chapel, 6 months since she'd sat alone on those cold steps in her wedding dress. She hesitated at the door, fingers tracing the worn wood. Her voice barely carried above the sound of the windmill. "Elias, what if they still laugh?" He looked at her for a long time, his expression steady, kind. "Then they'll have to do it while I'm standing beside you." And with that, she climbed into the wagon. The road to town felt longer than it used to, not because of the miles, but because every turn carried ghosts. She'd left Dry Hollow in shame. Now she returned in silence, with her chin lifted just enough to meet the sun. When they reached Main Street, heads turned. Men paused outside the general store, women lowered their voices near the well. Someone whispered her name, Clara Finch, and another muttered the old story, the runaway bride who was left behind. But Elias didn't slow the horses. He drove straight down the street, his broad frame unbothered, his hat low, his presence a quiet wall between her and the world. At the Mercantile, Clara stepped down from the wagon. For a heartbeat, everything stopped, the same way it had the day her groom never came. Then Mrs. Langford, the preacher's wife, stepped forward, her lips parting to say something cruel, but Clara beat her to it. "Good morning," she said softly. Her voice didn't shake. "Fine day for fresh starts, isn't it?" And just like that, the air shifted. Elias smiled faintly, proud but silent. He carried the flour, the nails, the lumber, and when they passed the old chapel on their way home, he slowed the wagon. Clara looked at the steps where her life had ended once. There was no bitterness in her eyes now, only a kind of quiet understanding. "I used to think this was the place where God forgot me," she whispered. Elias looked at the worn cross above the door. "Maybe it's where he found you," he said. The sun was setting when they turned back toward the ranch. The chapel bell, long silent, caught the wind, one low, broken note drifting after them like a benediction. And though neither said it out loud, they both knew, the woman who left town that morning was not the same one who'd been abandoned there months ago. She had walked through fire, and come out holding her own heart again. The days grew longer, and the sun lingered in the western sky, painting the hills with gold and shadow. At the cabin, life had found its rhythm again. The horses fed, the fences repaired, the hearth always warm. One evening, Elias took a small wooden box from the mantel. Inside lay the wedding ring, once lost in snow, once a symbol of betrayal. Now, it seemed to glow differently, as if it carried not the weight of broken promises, but the light of second chances. Clara watched him from the doorway. Her hands were busy folding laundry, but her eyes never left him. He approached her slowly, the ring in his rough palm. No words were spoken at first. Sometimes, words were too clumsy for what the heart needed to say. When he knelt before her, not as a man demanding anything, but as one offering a choice, he held out the ring. Clara's fingers hovered above it. She remembered the snow, the chapel steps, the silence of the town, and the fear that had once frozen her heart. And yet, in that same heartbeat, she remembered the warmth by the fire, the long rides across sunlit hills, the quiet strength of the man who had never let her fall again. Finally, she took the ring, not as a mark of what had been taken from her, but as a token of what had been found. The gold was warm in her hand, as though it had absorbed the kindness, patience, and hope that had brought her back to life. Elias smiled, faint, but true. This time, he said quietly, "Forever belongs to us. Not him, not the past. To us." Clara nodded. No tears fell, only the quiet shimmer of relief. And when she slid the ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. Outside, the wind stirred the branches, not with cold cruelty, but with gentle applause. The cabin, the fire, the hills, the snow-tinged grass, all bore witness to a love that had survived the storm, that had healed in silence, and now had bloomed openly. For the first time in years, Elias felt his chest lighten. The grief that had clung to him like shadow was softened by the warmth of her hand, the strength of her heart, and the quiet truth that sometimes, the world's cruelest acts only make room for grace. They sat together by the fire that night, the ring glinting in the lamplight, and in that silence, there was no past to haunt them, no fear to hold them back, only the promise of a shared horizon stretching endlessly before them. Spring had finally settled over Dry Hollow. The hills were green, the creek ran clear, and the air smelled of wildflowers and fresh earth. It was a world that had been waiting for them, a place where broken hearts could find warmth again. Clara moved with confidence now, her laughter carrying across the fields like the soft toll of bells. She helped Elias feed the horses, mend fences, and tend the small garden that had begun to flourish. Every day, she brought life to the cabin in ways he had forgotten were possible, a small miracle in a quiet place, built not of grand gestures, but of steady hands and patient hearts. Elias watched her from the porch one afternoon, the sun catching her hair like spun gold. He remembered the chapel steps, the snow, the storm, the cold weight of abandonment that had once pressed against her shoulders. And now, in her presence, that weight was gone, replaced with something softer, brighter, alive. They sat together on the porch that evening, the sky painted in streaks of orange and crimson, and the wind whispered through the hills, carrying with it the scent of new beginnings. Clara took his hand in hers, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no shadow of the past between them. The ring on her finger caught the last light of day, glinting with the promise of love reclaimed, of futures chosen, of hearts brave enough to try again. Elias spoke then, his voice low and steady. "Dry Hollow's been waiting a long time for a story like ours." She smiled, leaning against him, her fingers entwined with his. "Maybe it's not just the town," she whispered. "Maybe we've been waiting for it, too." The cabin, once a shelter for ghosts, now rang with warmth and laughter. The horses nickered in the paddock. The fire burned steadily in the hearth. Outside, the hills stretched into forever, and the sun dipped behind them, soft and forgiving, a light strong enough to melt any lingering shadow. That night, as stars dotted the sky like scattered silver, Elias and Clara sat side by side, watching the land that had once seemed so empty. Now it was full of hope, full of promise, full of love. They did not speak of the past, nor did they need to. It had brought them here, to this place, to each other, and that was enough. In Dry Hollow, beneath the endless sky, the winds of sorrow had finally shifted, and in their place, the gentle winds of grace, forgiveness, and newfound love carried them forward, together, toward a life neither had dared to imagine, but both now embraced with hearts wide open. The world could be harsh, the winds could howl, but love, patient, kind, redemptive, had found a way. And for Elias and Clara, it had come home.